All right. Welcome to Phoenix Book Club. This is week number 3. Because we're covering chapter 4 of the book. So this week is all about kind of the introduction to Ecto and changesets, and a little bit about the repository pattern. So we'll get started with our normal introductions, and because Dave Hackett happens to be the furthermost left on my screen, he will get to kick us off tonight.
All right. I'm Dave Hackett, and I work at Master Control. I have been messing around with Phoenix now since basically when we started reading the book 3 weeks ago. Really have enjoyed it. Been messing around with Elixir a little bit longer, reading a book on that. Really excited to hear everyone's thoughts this week about Chapter 4.
Sweet. Garrett, you're up next.
I forget, what am I supposed to do?
Introduction.
Oh, hi, I'm Garrett. I usually come in late. Sorry. I work at MX. I read the book, and it was good. And no, in particular, I really enjoyed it, comparing how the active record pattern, both like having done it both in Ruby and in a different language, and then coming to Elixir and seeing how they're doing it differently, specifically how Phoenix is doing it, because I really like how they separated some of the concerns. And anyways, we'll get into that later, but I'm Garrett, so trying to get my Twitter handle up.
All right. Film 42 for anyone curious so far. All right, John, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm John. I also work at MX, and this has been an interesting read for me because I've been crash coursing on Rails, Ruby, Elixir, and Phoenix all at the same time. And it's been interesting to see the simple correlations I see from both, or not both, but all of them. It kind of helps things click when I see all these differences and then understand how it's going. Anyway, so it's been a fun, maybe more confusing transition for me than the rest of you, but I enjoy it.
All right, Zach, you're up.
I'm Zach. I also work at MX. Been really enjoying playing with Elixir and Phoenix. Yeah.
Short and sweet. So I'm Mike Ries. I also work at MX. As I'm sure it's obvious, I co-opt everyone I know, mostly the people I work with, into doing these crazy things with me. Dave, I don't know how exactly I co-opted you into doing this, but I'm glad that I did. So this week, and I've just been into Erlang and Elixir for a long time, just kind of picking up Phoenix. I did like a prototype for possibly replacing a Rails app that we have at my job right now, and replacing that with something in Phoenix or Elixir, and it went okay, but it just wasn't compelling enough to really that I was really dying to make the switch and have our team adopt a second language. So recently had another idea about a way to try to infect my company with Elixir. So we'll see if I can make that roll. And this book club is partially, for me at least, it's partially about just learning and understanding things better, so that I know what strengths are there, and I know where it might be best applicable for this company and for whatever other companies I work for in the future. So that's me, and with introductions done, let's jump into the chapter. Who has questions or comments from the Ecto introduction chapter?
So I guess I'll go. This morning I was talking to one of my coworkers and was kind of explaining how I had in this chapter about change sets, and how I was like, whoa, in my mind, it was so cool that they were use repositories to make changes and validate data before it's even saved to a database. I just thought that was so cool, and using just kind of like being able to pipe that data through, like doing like an update change and a validator and doing those things. So I was like, wow, this is really neat. it was just for me, it was really cool to see that, like a visual cue, like using Elixir's pipe operator, right? So I really liked that, and it was something different for me, since we're not even really using, we're pretty much in my company, we're just using straight up SQL for like everything, and so I've messed around with Active Record and Rails. I would say even like I've mostly just dabbled with it, so I don't know any of the cool stuff. But comparing what I know, I was like, wow, this is really cool. Kind of like what I'm expecting some of you guys saw as well. I was like, oh, this is different but cool.
Yeah, I'm actually one of the questions that I have written down is, what did people think about having well, basically, is there anything about the change set that you didn't like? So there was one thing that stood out to me, and we'll open this up to wider discussion, but the main thing that stood out to me is having that virtual attribute in the schema. So here, I'll share code really quick. Video inception. So this is pretty much straight out of the book. But if we look at our user model, we have this schema users, which maps pretty closely to like the migrations that we created. And it had us create this password hash is what actually gets persisted in the database. And then this password, we set virtual true, which means this doesn't map to anything in the database, but it's a field that's going to exist during certain change sets. And I don't know, that to me feels a little bit wonky. I'm not exactly sure why, but like part of the idea of change sets was to say, hey, you shouldn't just have one set of validations that always apply to your model, and you end up with all these conditionals in those validations because depending on where the data is coming from, you know, if this is coming from a rate task, then just trust it. Like, we're the ones who wrote it, we're the ones controlling that input, just go do it. But if it's coming from like an end user on the public internet, then by all means, like, let's validate this thing very carefully before we actually use the data. And so that seemed like that was part of the idea of change sets initially, but then because they're very tied to like the schema that you've defined for this model, it just seemed, I don't know, it seemed really odd to me that that you put this attribute, which is not really a part of the model most of the time. It's only a part of the model when you're setting or changing the user's password. So why would that be like a definition on the model? Did anyone else find that kind of odd?
I did. I'll just say that.
I wonder if it might have some application, like in like the next, is it the next chapter that's talking about authenticating users? I wonder if they might explain it a little bit more. I don't know. I'm kind of guessing. I haven't read further, but I kind of it made me wonder if they were going to talk about it more in later chapters and explain it more. But I kind of ignored it and was like, okay, I'll just keep.
To show like, oh yeah, my model could potentially have a password field that doesn't necessarily, you know, the virtual true tells me that doesn't map directly to something that's in my schema.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it is useful, certainly like, because when you, whoa, what the heck did I just do? Sorry, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm actually just going to start actually flipping that back and forth all the time now. So it seems like I think that schema macro ends up creating a struct is what it looked like when I was looking at that data structure that comes out of the change set method, and so that's like it had to have a key there for the password because we had it in the form, and so like the form helpers end up using the change set data struct to help with rendering the form and setting values in the form and all that kind of stuff. So like I can kind of see the usefulness of it. I just wondered if there would be a good way to make that part of the change set be dynamic. So kind of the same way towards the top of that change set, you had the part where you said, oh, cast all the params, all the incoming params to their correct types. And you listed out, like, here's the required attributes that you should just fail if they're not there and they can't be coerced. And so that seemed like maybe a natural place to kind of say, hey, I'm also going to define some extra attributes or something like that that are only valid for this particular change set, not necessarily for the whole model itself. So I don't know. It strikes me as odd. I'm obviously, like you guys said, it's, you know, we have weeks ahead of us still of trying to understand all the use cases of these things. So maybe that trade-off ends up making a lot more sense next week. But at least this week, it just was something that stood out to me as kind of odd. Was there anything else about change sets that anyone noticed that they either really liked or were a little bit skeptical about?
I was just going to say, just with the virtual field, to me it was like we're taking this pure struct and then we're kind of pulling it out of the mess of kind of what active record is in terms of validations and in terms of fields on the model. And it was just, to me, it's like, oh, this seems really, really great. And then I see the virtual and it's almost like, it's really, really great. But, and then there's like this one little caveat, this one like condition that didn't work super well. So they wrote like they appended the pattern to kind of account for this one use case. And so again, I think I'm with all of you. I think we'll see more about it in the future, but it just kind of like, I was like, wait, what? That doesn't really make sense. But
yeah, I'll say one other thing that I really actually loved about change sets, as compared to other persistence models I've used in the past, is like in Rails, for instance, if you do have validations on your model, there's no way for you to really control the order of when those validations happen along with other things. So, for instance, if you wanted in your change set to say, oh, before you do anything with this attribute, downcase it and remove white space, trailing and leading white space. In the change set, you could very easily and explicitly say which order those two things should happen. Should the validation run first and then the sanitization, or the other way around? And it's not all that often that you need to control the order of that, because most of the time you want, you know, coercions, any sort of like manipulation of the data to happen before, and then you get validations just before you actually persist. So most of the time you're going to follow that pattern, but the few times you don't, trying to make that work in Rails is the few times I've had to do it sucked, because you're just relying on the library code to determine what things are going to be called and when, and you just get a chance to like hook in to some other process that someone else defines. So one thing I'm liking overall about Elixir, and specifically about change sets, is this ability to say, I'm just going to like lay out the order of events, and I can still have abstraction in there, because like one of those steps can actually do, you know, a complex operation. But I really like that as compared to other persistence models that I've seen, just to have a very explicit flow of like, this is exactly what's going to run and in what order, and so it can make a lot more sense to me if I'm trying to debug what's going on here.
I just had this thought as you were talking about like changing the flow. I thought, well, also I don't see how this would be like how you wouldn't be able to do this, but you could add another function that was going through another set of rules for your same model. I don't know where this would be applicable, but you could have like a second change set method, or 3 or 4, that could run through a different set of validations, or different data pre-processing, like trimming and downcasing, that kind of stuff. So instead of having to like have these huge kind of conditional, like I don't know, but being able to set up different validation pipelines just by defining multiple functions that would create your change set for you. That could be useful. I don't know. I haven't done enough with it to know one way or the other, but it's an interesting idea to me, at least.
Yeah, and I think I mean, as far as I could tell, it also looked like since change sets are just functions, I think you could kind of compose them together, so you could have like a common set of change set functions that you pretty much always use, like, well, I'm just always going to do coercions, and I'm always going to run this one validation. Maybe there's one or two validations that just always apply. And so I think you could make up a change set of other change sets, but I haven't actually tried it. I'll make a note to myself to try that. Change sets. All right. Dang, I wish Paul was on tonight. I have a feeling he would know the answer to that question offhand. Any other things that people really liked or didn't like from the chapter? Right. Oh, I actually have one more, Greg. Sorry, I'll share my screen. Actually, this is it's a decent segue. It's not a great segue into it. So in our Slack channel, we were talking about like what's a +1 thing that we can try to do, or like do more than just the code that was in the actual book for this chapter. And one of the things that got brought up is like, oh, during this chapter, you only end up implementing, or the chapter only covers the code for doing a create and a new, and then you kind of just reuse your show and index from the previous chapter. But I decided to try to just implement a delete because it seemed easier than trying to implement update. So I kind of got this working, but one thing that I thought was really interesting is I was looking at the documentation. Let's see, Ecto, delete. So let's see, Repo.delete too. So the documentation here basically says like, oh, if you call delete, you get OK, and which model got deleted. Whoa, where did that just go? Come on, buddy. All right. And then there's also, though, there's this delete bang version, which just returns the model or raises an error, and that seems to be a pretty common functionality. But what was a little bit odd to me is that if I actually start this thing up and say something like rumble repo.delete rumble.user, and then I think I have to do rumble.user ID, and if I give it some ID that doesn't actually exist, like 0, I expected this. Oh, actually, I'm not calling this thing right. Hang on, what does the code look like over here? Repo.delete. Oh, I don't have to specify this one. It knows by the type of the structure I'm passing in. Okay, so I expected if I called delete bang like this, that would fail. But what I thought was interesting is that I thought if I called it like this, and the database encountered an error, I assumed that error would be returned as a like error reason tuple, like that. But it actually just still raises an exception, or whatever they're called in Elixir. I don't remember off the top of my head. But anyway, that was the only other thing that I noticed this week that just struck me as off. Like I thought that a database level exception would be the same thing as like my change set throwing an exception, right? Like if a validation in my change set fails, that does get returned as an error with a reason on there. But I thought it was interesting that database exceptions just don't get handled that way, and so I couldn't easily pattern match on that in my delete action in the controller. I just had to. I mean, I just didn't handle it for now. I just let the error raise and break the request. But obviously, I'd rather not catch that exception. I'd rather just pattern match on it and pass it down to another view or something like that. So that was the only other thing that I noticed that seemed off.
So in general, in Elixir, does it follow like the same pattern as Ruby, the bang versus non-bang methods, or does Elixir follow like a different semantic on that? Do you know? I don't know.
Yeah, it's in Dave Thomas's book. He talks about it a little bit, and it certainly seems from just from the code in general that I've seen around, it's very common that that a given function will either have a non-bang version that will return a tuple of OK, like the atom OK, and a result, or it will return error and a reason why it failed. And then if you don't particularly care about the error, like let's say you needed to read a config file, and literally if that config file is not there, you just want your program to blow up, then you would call read bang instead of just read, because you don't care about pattern matching on the OK in that case. You're like, no, if something goes wrong, just raise an exception because I'm not going to handle it. So that seems to be the pattern in both Elixir and Erlang. That's, I think, something that kind of got inherited from the Erlang community as well. And so it's not exactly the same as the Ruby convention of bang methods, but very similar in the idea that, like, oh, if I want to call it in a way that it just blows up when it can't do the right thing, then you just call that as a bang method.
Yeah, because I see that pattern, like I like to compare the generated Phoenix code versus the code that I'm writing. And so I see the pattern that you're talking about where it returns like a tuple with the symbol and the data, either like either the user or whatever it returns in that tuple. If it errors, like it uses the repo insert method, I know at least follows that pattern looking at the generated code. So that is interesting that delete doesn't follow that same pattern.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know, that might even just be like an implementation issue in the Postgres adapter or something. Who knows? But it seems like certainly it was intended to catch certain error cases, but maybe they just don't consider that a normal error case or something like that. Maybe they do consider that to be exceptional. But it seemed to me like that comes up all the time in my apps, that like two users might try to delete the same thing, and one of them will actually delete it, and the other one can't delete it because it's already gone. So just seemed like something that shouldn't have been an exception. But anyway, we'll see. I guess I'll try and bug Chris about it or something like that. All right, so then from there, what I was thinking is we could transition to kind of just sharing some code of any +1 stuff that people implemented. But before we jump to that, does anyone else have anything that they thought of that they really liked or disliked from Ecto? All right. Who wants to go first for +1 stuff?
I could show what I did. That's right thing. Yeah, okay. So let's see. I was able to add some. No, was it in here? I was trying. Oh, so most recently I've been working on a delete controller action, and so basically I was like, I'm not sure what it is. So I Google searched for, or I think I just looked on Phoenix's website for their guides. So it was basically like following their guide for there. My problem came in on when I was trying to figure out, okay, we'll do it with a link, and I couldn't figure it out. What kind of syntax I was trying to follow their guide, so I didn't get that. But I did get on the change set, I was able to add some an update change for stripping white space off and then downcasing. So I was really surprised that it was that easy, that I could just add that one line to be able to strip any white space, downcase it. It was surprising to me because I didn't know what to expect. I was like, oh, I don't know, let's figure it out. So that was pretty cool for me. Just the thing I was trying to figure out was like, how do I make a link to delete, and so this is where I was stuck at right here, was just getting that set up. But those were the plus ones that I was able to do.
Sweet. Do you mind? Could you just show it running in your browser if you? I don't know if that's easy to start up or not for you.
Yeah. Well, right now it's got an error.
Just live code it. No pressure.
Yeah. No pressure. Well, let's see. Are you guys? What are you guys seeing right now? I'm not even sure.
The code editor.
Okay. Let me change that. Maybe.
Yeah, I think you have to stop sharing your screen and then switch to share my whole screen.
Okay. Did it stop sharing my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Let's just do that one. Okay. Whoa. Okay. All right. So that's the error that I've got right now that I'm trying to figure out. It's telling me that 2 is required. But if I was to take that out, which, let's just try that.
Oh, I know that one actually. I did that one.
Oh.
I know this. It's a Unix system.
Wow. It's 1993 and we're watching Jurassic Park.
So glad you got that reference. All right, so right next to method, if you so right after your delete, if you just do a comma and then do a 2 colon, so you just add another keyword.
Oh, so like at the end here?
Uh-huh. And then you can call user path and pass it the connection. And, oh, sorry, it's @con.
Yeah.
And then pass it colon delete and user.id. So it's basically looks very similar to the link view above, except you're passing an additional argument, which is the method delete. So give that a try, and I think that's what did it for me.
Yeah, so I just saved it. This is one thing that I've loved. So I just saved and it auto-reloaded. I love that. I freaking love that. That is so awesome.
Yeah,
but,
I don't know how we haven't brought that up yet, but yes, also love.
Oh, yeah, it was sweet. All right. We'll try it out. Oh, that's a fail. What's it doing? Oh, is it not working? All right, so that's not as cool, but so I can show off my, so if I just do like a bunch of spaces and say, oh wait, no, I'm not. This is the name. All right, so we've got dash par and a bunch of spaces on the username, and we'll uppercase it. That doesn't care about that. So I had it displaying the username so that I could verify. So it did lowercase it and strip the white space. So like in my user template, all I did was add the username right there with just another dash username just to see it so that I could verify that worked. So yeah, I'll have to figure out why my delete isn't working or what's up with that, because I don't know. Oh well, but yep, that's what I got.
Sweet, that was awesome. Zach, am I remembering right that you did a +1 thing?
You are not remembering right.
Okay, I promise that I didn't intentionally do that.
It was on my to-do list, but I didn't do it.
All right.
Well done, Dave.
All right. So I did have. Oh, sorry. Did Garrett or John? Did either of you want to show a +1 thing? Okay.
I didn't do a +1 really out of the book, but I did have an idea that maybe I'll try to get next week. When we were talking about the Amazon Echo stuff I was doing, I thought, since if I'm gonna have to make my own endpoint and host it, maybe I'll make some Phoenix API endpoints and see if I can get the data through that way. We'll see if I actually can do it or not, but I'll try to bring it next week.
I think that's a +10. That's not just a +1. If, by the way, when you go to, I mean, you probably already have your own place to host this, but if you want to, I have just an Amazon micro instance that I put a bunch of Docker containers that have Elixir apps running in them all the time, and it has extra space. So if you want to throw that up, then you can just put it on there and assign a DNS entry to it if you want to. So, all right, I will show, let's see, one thing here real quick. So let's see. Oh, okay. So a little follow-up from last week. Last week we talked a little bit, or I think Paul brought up this thing called, I think that's right. Okay. So this is mine. It looks pretty similar. The things I changed is I added another migration. I added the second migration. I just was curious what it looked like to add more schema, because I feel like that's something I have to do all the time. And then similarly, in my user model, I had to add that email field to my schema here, add it to the list of required params. And then it looked like I did this a little bit differently than you did it, Dave. But I kind of did that same thing where I downcased and I stripped white space. But I did it in 2 separate update changes instead of 1. And so it looked like you had done it as like this. Am I remembering that right?
Yeah,
like that?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I mean, I didn't even think to do that. But anyway, so just a slightly different way of doing that. And then I also did add, so on my views, I did add a delete button just to the show, not to the list view. And it does that thing. So anyway, I still have kind of the basic validations that we talked about before. I didn't add any other validations, but that was pretty cool to work on. But then the thing that I thought was extra cool is if you have your Phoenix app up and running, I tried this thing out that Paul mentioned last week, the observer. So this is that, like, if you just run that command, you get this window that pops up immediately. And like right away, this is a whole bunch of really interesting information to me. Like there's 247 Erlang processes running in my Erlang VM right now. I'm using a total of 37 megs of RAM and kind of where that RAM is being spent. It gives you like load charts of how busy all of your schedulers are. So this is kind of a rough equivalent of just how busy your total system CPUs are. But basically, for each CPU that the Erlang VM sees, by default it creates a scheduler, which is in charge of scheduling all the different actors in your system, all the different processes. And so this is showing you how heavily you're utilizing each of those different schedulers. So you can see how busy your app is. I actually have no idea what these memory allocators do, but cool, more graphs. And then this is the one that I thought was super interesting is you can see each of the different kind of supervision trees. So each one of these is an OTP application. So like Elixir itself loads itself as an OTP app, Cowboy is an OTP app. And then the thing that I thought was most interesting, so there's like, here's the thing that talks to Postgres, and here's Phoenix. But then if you look at Rumble, which is our app, this is all of a sudden much, much larger. And it's because this is kind of the main, like the root of the supervision trees. You just get a supervisor. And it's kind of doing 2 things. It's monitoring your endpoint. Endpoint has like the code reloading stuff on it. And then it's also, this is kind of your server that is actually spinning up a whole bunch of like kind of a pool of processes to handle the incoming requests. And it also, this is doing like pub sub stuff. So that was super interesting. And then the other thing that your main supervisor is watching is your repo and the pool of all the processes that are basically managing connections to the database. And so you can see where that pool lives. And anyway, this to me was like really interesting to be able to see all of that stuff. And I can double click on any one of these and see a whole bunch of information, like if there's messages waiting in its mailbox right now, you can see those. You can see the process dictionary. You can see a stack trace for it. And then here's the current state of that gen server, which you can break out more detailed. So anyway, all of this stuff, like I had seen a demo of it once, but had never really played around with it. And I was pretty blown away by that set of tools, that it was a super easy way just to, I mean, that's, like, I've wanted that so many times in object-oriented languages, to be able to see, like, at runtime, what objects exist and are sending methods to each other as a way of kind of profiling my application or looking for bottlenecks or other things like that. And the fact that I could actually pull up that visualization and it's just built into the virtual machine was pretty cool on my list. That's best, definitely double thumbs up for me.
Have you noticed like any extra overhead when you're running the observer?
I have no idea, actually. Let's try.
I wonder if it's just like sampling, or if it's full on like profiling the VM.
I know that it. So you can ask it. Well, let's just do this. Actually, oh yeah, it's over here. All right. So CPU load. We'll just kind of leave this running so we can kind of get an idea of. Well, here's an interesting stat right off the bat, is that freaking Google Chrome takes infinity more resources than my Phoenix app. Probably not surprising. So you can do this. You can add traces, and I haven't gone through all of this, and there's actually a Elixir SIPs episode about another tool called Early Burly or something like that, which is basically just a screenception. It basically shows you, it'll like load all your modules for you, and it makes it so you can just double click things to trace. But if you add one of these in, it basically does do profiling for a given function. So you can say, hey, start tracing everyone who calls this function, and give it a module name and a function name, and it'll start tracing it. And you can also add trace patterns and stuff like this. So I know these things do cost you a lot of resources. And actually, there's a really good book called When Things Go Wrong, Erlang in Anger, or something like that. It's by some people at Heroku, and it's just all about like which things are safe to do in production and which things should you not ever do in production, because they'll bring your app to a screeching halt. And so he has a bunch of the authors of that book had a bunch of but anyway, I don't know off the top of my head. But let's just see. So if I'm kind of sitting around there, and if I actually do find, here's my bean running, and it's using like around 1% CPU. So somewhere between like 0.5% and 1.5% CPU. And if I turn that off, doesn't look much different. Still kind of hovering around 1% CPU. So, I mean, it must be using some resources, but it doesn't. I don't think until you start tracing something, I don't think it's using much resources.
And then did you use that this week to when you were working on some code that used RabbitMQ? Or did you pull up Observer in the RabbitMQ process to check memory usage and things like that?
I didn't. So RabbitMQ has its own set of tools just in its admin dashboard that you can like see all the nodes in your cluster. You can just click on one, and they basically they're reaching out and grabbing a lot of the same data that shows up in Observer, but they actually provide their own dashboards around it. So I didn't need to use it for that when I was doing the RabbitMQ stuff this week. Although that would actually be really interesting to see. I'm sure people use it for stuff like that when they're when they're trying to optimize Rabbit itself or other Erlang projects, but I didn't have to use it.
Dang it. Missed opportunity, man.
I am planning on using it, so that prototype that I did for our work, that I wasn't sure where my bottlenecks were happening. This is obviously would be a really good tool for trying to look into that and trying to understand when I put it under stress, where was I hitting that bottleneck? Because when I built this prototype for work, it was basically like I could get about 4x the throughput of the corresponding Rails app. But when I would hit that 4x, I was only at like 30% of the CPU, even including system CPU usage. So I didn't really know where I was getting stuck. I just knew that I still had a lot more room in terms of resources to keep getting that more throughput. But I wasn't sure if that was in the way I was using 0MQ or something else. So obviously this would be a good tool to go back and try to optimize that. So let's maybe then to wrap up the call, we can just go around the horn and have everyone mention kind of their favorite thing that they learned in Elixir or Erlang, or just I guess any sort of programming stuff that you did this week that was just hit you as super cool. So let's just do that to wrap up the call for tonight, and then we'll call it a night from there. Who wants to start out?
So I'll start. This is very simplistic, but I like the piping and the idea of just function after function when running your code, where it's essentially one function piped to another all the way down until you get the manipulation that you want down the line. And so when we just pointed out earlier how Dave had basically two functions in to strip the white space and downcase it. I didn't think of that either, but then I saw it and I go, oh, well, that makes sense. That concept is there, and it was kind of cool. And then that, and I will reiterate that the live refreshing once you make changes has been so helpful to know if hitting the last key and enter on your code and it's saving and seeing your browser refresh right behind your terminal session or something like that. It's been super convenient.
I'll go next. Along with the live refreshing, I have been very, very pleased with the helpful error messages. I mean, so even the one that was up on my screen when I was trying to figure it out it was saying, hey, 2 is a required option on that function. And I thought, how nice is it that it figured it out and was nice enough to tell me. It wasn't just like some random error, like missing option. Well, I don't know what option they're talking about then. And but I've been loving their helpful error messages. Like even I can't remember the specific one that I had, but I had this error message and it was saying, oh, you're trying to do this. I was like, wow, that's. So I thought that was really. I think they have a really robust error messages informing you, hey, maybe you should try this, or hey, this is just wrong, and so it was helpful for me. Like it gave me a base to start from. So like I had 5 minutes before the call started, and I was trying to Google search like, what should I throw in this 2 option for a delete. I didn't know. I was trying to figure it out. So I've been loving the error messages.
Zach or Garrett, I'm not going next.
Oh, I didn't know if he was finished. You could kind of your feed for me just kind of like died out. I was like, you gonna say something? I can go though. One thing that was super interesting for me tonight was just seeing the tooling. And I know we talked about it last week, and my gear demo was really cool this week. But I remember like people always said Java sucks. And so I had this mentality that Java was terrible until I actually used it, and you learned how to use the debugger, and I learned how to do all this crazy introspection of the JVM, and I was like, oh my gosh, like maybe Java isn't the most fun thing to code at times, but the tooling around Java is just incredible, and that made Java such an appealing language for me to want to use. And so seeing this like awesome tooling around the Erlang VM, how mature it is, and what you can do with it, is really like something that's enticing, and it makes me want to keep pursuing Elixir and Erlang together, because I feel like the community and the tooling is there to support me when I need it.
All right, I guess I'm up. So this week I've been watching a lot of the ElixirConf videos, and one of them that I really enjoyed was Elixir Should Take Over the World by Jessica Kerr. It's like the keynote, and it's awesome. Check it out. But one thing that she mentioned there is this testing tool. So I was thinking about I kind of want to start testing this Phoenix app, and how would I do that? And she mentions this testing. It's Erlang specific, not Elixir, but it's called, I don't know how you pronounce this. It's spelled Quviq. Qviq? I don't know. Sure. And basically, it's this tool that will write tests for you, and it looks super awesome. So it writes a bunch of these tests. It tests your state machines, and it's supposed to go through and find basically the edge cases to really help you find these edge cases. And I'm looking through it, and it looks like the only languages that it supports are C and Erlang. So that's super cool. And it's supposed to automatically write these tests for you, and you can kind of adjust the input and stuff. But like Garrett mentioned, I think that tooling is super cool to just research and see what's out there. So I've kind of been looking at Qviq. I want to play around with it, but I haven't got around to it. And then the other thing I mentioned earlier, I was just reading Twitter right now, and so Jose Valim mentions and Chris McCord mentioned, they're testing their Rails app. They got 128,000 concurrent connections on just a normal, what do they say? It's a 4-core, 16 gigabyte single machine. And Jose Valim says, we didn't tweak any system parameters. They just ran default Phoenix in a production environment, and they were able to get that sort of throughput, which I think is freaking awesome. So I don't know. Those are the two things. I didn't do any plus ones or anything, but I've just been kind of trying to explore more of the Elixir community and see what's out there and what. The other thing that was really cool is the Nerves project. I'm really interested in that. I want, like I said in the first video, I want to rewrite my senior project, which is there's an embedded aspect of that where you're gathering data from sensors and sending it to a web server. So I'm like, hey, why not write everything in Phoenix or in Elixir? So I'm just, been kind of seeing what's out there, and it's been really awesome to just see the types of tools that are there.
Sweet. So, I mean, I think for me this week, kind of piggybacking on you, Zach, the benchmark stuff was really interesting to see. I was thinking about, so at work we do have this one application that uses a phase server, and man, everyone just loves Event Machine, the Ruby implementation of Event Machine. Especially Garrett, he doesn't want to see it go away. He just wants
so many fires in production.
And but I was thinking about that, and I was like, we added more nodes to that service, and we also added a bloom filter to make it to help optimize how many things do we actually need to publish, and stuff like that. And we did all that work just because keeping a ton of people connected to it and keeping a whole bunch of messages flowing through that system was becoming a problem. And now it's becoming a problem at 10,000-ish people, right? And so to see even just an early benchmark that's 128,000 people connected, no big deal. Everyone still got their messages in single-digit milliseconds. That was, impressive to say the very least. So that seemed really interesting. Um, and so I haven't played around with that stuff very much either, Zach, but the generative testing tool, I think it's the company that's called Qvig, and I don't remember what the name of the tool is, but it's kind of the thing that inspired a bunch of generative testing tools.
It's called QuickCheck.
Oh yeah, QuickCheck. And so that inspired a whole bunch of generative testing tools in Clojure and in other communities, but that project in itself has a lot of really cool history. Like there was a team at Toyota that was doing some projects, and they used QuickCheck, and one of their QuickCheck runs that ran like overnight, and it just was generating millions and millions of sets of inputs. It found this race condition that if the team hadn't caught it, it was an edge case where basically it would have been like a crash scenario for one of their cars. Obviously, they didn't do enough of that because they've had some other issues. But that being said, like as a way to help reduce the number of those kinds of issues in a very complex system, the thing that really has stood out to me this week around Elixir and Erlang overall is really how ready it is to be adopted by like full teams. And so I was thinking about how when I was first learning Ruby, I loved Ruby. And there were certain things about it that I felt like were major selling points for a company. And so for a company to adopt Ruby, it was like, oh, there's this really healthy ecosystem of Ruby gems, and the testing culture in the community is super, super good. So there's certain things that were like very clear selling points. But at the time, it would have been really hard to convince people like, hey, if we do run into issues where we need to profile this, what do the profiling tools look like? Or what are our options as far as CI servers and stuff like that? And all of that, of course, has become very mature in Ruby, and it's a story that keeps getting better in the world of Ruby. But it's been really interesting to walk over into the world of Elixir and just see that because of the Erlang VM, very similar to the idea of doing something like JRuby, we can actually leverage this whole set of tools that actually already exists, and it requires very little tweaking or configuring to make all those tools just work, so that not just as someone who wants to write code on an individual basis, but as someone who wants to contribute to a complex system that has to be maintained by a lot of other people, it has to be able to be profiled and performance checked by other people and security checked by other people. All of that stuff has an incredibly mature story in Elixir and Erlang, so that's really been the big story for me this week in Elixir and Erlang. Is just I'm super excited that when I can find a really good use case for this where it will make a big impact to our team, really the only hurdle that is left for me to try to sell to my team or my company and really to myself, because I don't want the team to adopt it if it's not in the best interest of the team. But really the only hurdle that's left is just the learning curve, and just saying, hey, if we want to adopt another language to write backend services in, people on the team are going to have to learn Elixir, and there is a definite learning curve there, and it changes the way you think about code, which is good, but it is a cost that has to be assessed. But that's now like the only thing that's really left on the table as far as making this something that I can easily sell to a company as a reason that they should use this tool. So that to me is really cool. So that's my final thought. Anyone else want to weigh in with final thoughts or things that you guys are curious about for next week?
I guess I'll throw out just keep your minds open. Think about plans for this next week. Reading. Very creative though, so I rely on other people. I'm a leech, so but I'll try and keep my creative juices flowing.
Sweet. And next week, someone needs to remind me, but after we do introductions, before we jump into this week, to kind of show if we learned anything as a result of those questions. I had 2 of them for Chapter 3, but I'll save them for next week because this call is already plenty long as it is. So I guess that's it. If we don't have any other final comments, then thanks everyone for being on the call tonight, and we'll see you guys all next week.
Thanks, guys. See you later.
Thanks.
See you next week.
Bye.